So the past 3 weeks before this, we have been looking at this series called The Waiting Room. And we've been discussing and exploring and looking at what to do when we are waiting on God. We're waiting on Him to answer our prayers, to do something in our life, to make some sort of change. A lot of times we just wait, and that's a problem because we live in a very microwave type society. We want things done now, we want things instantly, and we don't like waiting. But as we know, it's a part of life. And oftentimes, waiting is especially part of our faith, that God uses waiting and kind of puts us in a waiting room to teach us, to transform us, to help us to trust Him better with the life He's leading us into and us following Jesus. And to recap, what we've looked at is the first week we looked at that sometimes we are just forced to wait. We don't want to wait. We're asking for something. We want it now, but God says, nope, you're going to wait, and we're forced to wait. And we looked at Habakkuk's situation as Israel was waiting on the Messiah and the Savior, and they waited 600 years for that. And then we looked at, even though we're forced to wait, sometimes we just refuse it. Like God tells us to wait in the moment, and we go, you know what, I don't want to do this, God. I'm going to look for shortcuts. I'm going to do my own thing. And when we refuse to wait, oftentimes we miss what God wants to do with us while we're waiting in that waiting room. And we looked at Judas for that. And last week we looked at what happens when you choose to wait. When you're faithful and you choose to say, God, your timing, not mine. And we looked at how David patiently waited for God's promise to come true. But what happens when we choose to wait? And we go into a situation where, like, God, I'm praying for this. I'm asking for this. I want to wait. I'm trusting you in this. What happens when we wait and we choose to wait, but we get tired of that waiting? When we're waiting and the days turn into weeks, into months, into years, and we're still not getting the answer we're looking for, what happens when we get tired of waiting? Because oftentimes we get very tired and we get impatient, right? Like, think about simple things like traffic. Like, you hit traffic, you're frustrated. One of the first things we react to do is like, okay, is there a shorter way around? If I'm hitting traffic, going through the city, can I go a different route because I don't want to wait to get through this traffic? We look for that shortcut. We get tired of it. Or when we're parenting, and parents, you can probably agree with this, you get to the point where the one kid or one of your kids are just not listening anymore, and you're just done with it. So you do what every good parent does. You pawn them off on the other parent. Like, you're just like, okay, you don't go talk to your mother right now because I can't handle you. We get tired of waiting. And those are minor things, but what about bigger things that we're waiting for? What about the big things in life, the important things that we're asking for? Often we can get tired for waiting for those things. Even in the midst of choosing to wait on God's timing, it gets exhausted. And so let me ask you this. What are you tired of waiting for? What's something you are sick of waiting for an answer for or some sort of movement for? Maybe you're tired of this political season, right? I was talking to a couple guys yesterday on the way up to McConnell's Mill, and they're like, only a few more weeks to these ads. Like, they're almost done. Like, we're getting there. But then we have a whole new set of problems post-election, but we're sick of the political season. We're tired of the ads. We're tired of this tension. Or maybe you're sick of the racial tension. And you're wondering, when is there going to be solution and progress made in that? And maybe it's not just the tension you're sick of. Maybe you're just sick of racism in general. And when is there going to be progress going to be made there? When is there going to be healing there? When are we going to see that sin start going away? Maybe we're tired of the brokenness around us. Or maybe it's more personal for you. Maybe you're tired of waiting for that answered prayer. Maybe you're tired of the family tensions you're dealing with. You're tired of waiting for that special someone in your life. Maybe you're tired of waiting on the thing you've been hoping for so long, and you're just tired of waiting. Because we can get tired of waiting. When we're tired of waiting, that's when we're at risk to make some poor decisions. Now think about when you're physically tired, right? Like, when you're physically tired, how do you act? Are you of sound judgment in mind? No, like, there's that thing, like, if you're overtired, it's the equivalent of driving drunk when you're driving. Like, it's risky when you're tired because you don't make smart decisions. You're not working with a sound mind. And the same thing can happen when we get tired of waiting. We get exhausted, and our judgments and our decisions are at risk in that moment. So as we're wrapping up our series, I want to look at this tension is, what do we do when we're tired of waiting on God? And we're going to look at two biblical characters that were in their waiting room. We've been doing that throughout this whole series with Habakkuk and Judas and David. But today we're going to compare and contrast two people from the same family line, and both handled their weariness of waiting very differently while they sat in their waiting room. The first person we're going to look at is Abraham. Abraham was God's chosen person to start a family And that family would grow to become a nation. And through that nation, a person would come to rescue the entire world named Jesus. And so this was God's plan, a person to become a family, to become a nation. And through that nation comes Jesus. And Abraham was that person. When God first connected with Abraham, he was known as Abram, eventually changed his name to Abraham. But he made this promise to Abraham. And this is what his promise was in Genesis 12, verses 2 and 3. He goes, this is God speaking to Abraham. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. All peoples. Now think about this for a second. We're blessed because through that family that became a nation came Jesus. We're blessed because of Jesus, all because it started with Abraham. That's a big deal, right? The hope of the world started with this man named Abraham. But here's the issue. At this point, when God is talking to Abraham, he's 75 years old, and he and his wife Sarah do not have children. Now, to become a family that becomes a nation, you need to have children, right? When you're 75, the chances aren't looking great in that situation. And Sarah was about almost 10 years younger than him at this point. So they're both old, but God promises children to this family. And as Abraham hears this promise, he gets excited, but then he gets tired of waiting because time goes on and him and Sarah still do not have children. Genesis 15, 2 through 6, this is what happens. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abraham said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him and said, this man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. And so in that culture, if you don't have an heir, it's going to go to somebody else in your household. And in this situation, you'd go to a servant of Abram's. He was still Abram at this point. He's not Abraham yet, but we call him Abraham for simplicity's sake right now. So Abraham has this servant. If he doesn't have a child, everything he owns, his wealth, his land, his property, his animals, everything will go to Eliezer, his top servant. And he's like, God, you promised me a family. You promised me kids. It's still not happening. What will you give me? Because you made this promise. And God reminds him of his promise, says, listen, it's not going to your servant. I'm going to give you a child of your own flesh and blood, and come outside with me. Look at the stars. Just look at the stars you're seeing. Now, we live in Pittsburgh. There's lights everywhere, so we don't get great star looking up in the sky, right? It kind of stinks. Like, we were actually up at Cook Forest this past week for a quick day trip, and there was no lights, and we were looking outside one day, and there are so many stars in the sky. It was amazing. But God tells Abraham, look at all these stars. This is what your descendants are going to be like. You can't even count how many there are. You won't be able to count the descendants you have through your family lineage. So he reminds Abraham of his promise, and Abraham trusts God in that moment. He's still in his waiting room. He's tired of waiting. He asks God, but he says, it says he believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Okay? This, again, that promise takes place. And yet he waits even longer. 10 years go by from the original promise. Abraham is in his mid-80s and still doesn't have a child. How many people do you know, males in their mid-80s, wives in her mid-70s, and they're popping out kids? Like, nope, not happening. In fact, we saw it be a medical marvel in this situation, right? Well, this is where they're at. And Sarah, Abraham's wife, steps in. And she goes, Abraham, we still don't have a child. Maybe it's my fault. Maybe it's my problem. I'm too old. Why don't you sleep with our maidservant Hagar and try to have a child with her? Now we're like, what? Like, this is crazy, right? Like, no one's in our culture to go, hey, honey, we don't have a child. Why don't you sleep with our friend over here and maybe you get a child with them? Like, that's not what we're going to say in our culture, correct? Well, in this culture, that was actually a logical idea. In this culture, what happens is their maidservants were slaves, and they were treated as property. And the way a family kept going, the way the family found value is by having an heir, specifically a son who was an heir. So having children was a big, big deal in this culture. And so having this maidservant around, it was their property, Abraham and Sarah's. It was slavery. It wasn't good, but this is what they did. And so whatever happened with that maidservant was the property of the owners, so it would be Abraham and Sarah's. And so Sarah goes, you sleep with Hagar, and if you guys have a child, then we have an heir, and we can get this show on the road. God, maybe this is what God wants us to do. And so this is what happens. They kind of take matter in their own hands. They're looking for a shortcut. They got so tired of waiting, they kind of thought of their own plan. But here's the problem. The first time Abraham got tired, he went to God and said, God, what are you going to do here? And God reminded him of the promise. This time, Abraham and Sarah did not go to God. They created this idea on their own, and Abraham's like, all right, let's do this. And this is what happened. And so he slept with Hagar, and Hagar gets pregnant, and they have a child. But this was not the promise that God made to Abraham. It was going to be between he and his wife. And so in their tiredness of their waiting, they chose a shortcut. It wasn't part of God's plan or promise. And honestly, I can understand the tension Abraham and Sarah has in this moment. They have this promise, but they look at their biological clock and think, there's no way this is going to happen. We've got to think of another solution. We can't trust God because we're past this opportunity. And so let's do something else. And oftentimes, I think that's what we do as people. As we start thinking we know better than God and go, you know what, I can't trust God on this. I'm going to trust myself. I'm looking for a shortcut. They got tired of waiting and chose not to trust God. And this was Abraham's failure. He listened to the wrong guidance in his waiting, and he took a shortcut. Let me ask you this. In your waiting, would you want to take a shortcut? If you can get your answer quickly, even if it's not the direction God wants you to go, would you take it? Because I think a lot of us would, because we want our answers right away. But Abraham chose to take that shortcut. It was not what God wanted, and it created tension down the line. But here's the thing. God still stayed faithful, kind of staying with this story. When Abraham was about 100 years old, and Sarah was in her early 90s, she became pregnant. And that's a miracle in and of itself. And she gave birth to Isaac. And Isaac would go on to have offspring of his own, and that would lead to a great family, to a great nation that led to Jesus. In all of this, there was 25 years of waiting from the original promise to Isaac being born. That's a long time. And that happened through God's faithfulness, not Abraham's. Because Abraham got tired of waiting and kind of took his own shortcut. But what's crazy is from Abraham became Isaac, and Isaac had a kid named Jacob, and Jacob had a son named Joseph, and that's who also we're going to look at today. So we're looking at Abraham's great-grandson now. So saw Abraham's situation. Let's look at Joseph's real quick. Joseph was the great-grandson of Abraham, and Joseph was the second youngest of 13 sons, and he was the favorite of his father, Jacob. And so already there is this tension with him and his brothers because he's the favorite of their dad. Now, how many of you guys are not the favorite of your family? Just me? Aaron? Okay, cool. I'm not the favorite. I make a joke all the time. My baby brother, Austin, he's the favorite of our family. Between me, my middle brother, Chad, and Austin gets all the goods. He's the favorite of my mom. She takes care of him. He's not here to defend himself right now, so I can keep saying this. He's the favorite, okay? This is what happens. So I'm on the outside, and Chad and I are like, this is really messed up. Well, this is what happened here. Joseph is the favorite, and then he gets this dream. He's already hated by his brothers, and then he gets this dream from God that one day the rest of his brothers would bow down to him because of how great he's going to be used by God. And his brothers at this point were like, forget this. First of all, he's already the favorite. Then he has the guts to tell us that we're going to bow down to him. Let's take care of business. Now, in my world, Chad and I would just beat on Austin a little bit. In Joseph's brothers' world, you know what they did to get rid of him? They sold him into slavery. Real story. They get sick. They hear Joseph tell about this dream. They're like, okay, we're done now. They were going to kill him at first. And they said, let's not kill him. Dad get mad about that. Let's just sell him to slavery. Rational solution, right? This is what they did, though. They sold him into slavery, and over the next 20 years of Joseph's life, because it covers 13 chapters in Genesis, this is what happens. Joseph becomes a slave. Then he served really well in that role and eventually became a servant in this guy Potiphar's house. And he became such a good servant in Potiphar's house, Potiphar put him in charge of his entire house. But Joseph was always a good-looking dude as well, so Potiphar's wife started having, looking upon Joseph like, okay, this guy's good-looking, maybe I can get him to sleep with me. But Joseph sees that Potiphar's wife is wanting to hook up with him. Joseph doesn't want to do that, so he refuses her advances multiple times. Potiphar's wife gets really angry about that, accuses him of sexual assault. Potiphar gets angry angry at Joseph, throws Joseph in the prison. You with me still? We keep going? So this is what keeps happening to Joseph. He's in prison now. After not doing anything wrong and serving Potiphar, he's sitting in prison. While he's in prison, he is taking care of fellow prisoners. The cupbearer and the baker are in the prison with Joseph, who's supposed to work for the pharaohs. He helps them interpret a dream, gets them back out of prison. He's helping them out, saying, hey, remember me now and get me out of prison as well. They don't do that. He stays in prison. Eventually, they remember to get Joseph out of prison, and they remember because he has the ability to interpret dreams, he can go help the Pharaoh interpret a dream that Pharaoh was freaking out about. Joseph went to the Pharaoh and said, here's what happened to your dream. Here's what's going to take place. Here's what you have to do. Pharaoh was so impressed with it, he put Joseph in charge of a bunch of stuff. Eventually, Joseph was so good at his job, he became second in command in Egypt. And because he was good at interpreting a dream, he actually solved the food crisis they were in and saved the entire country and the people around him. He's the hero of the world. All that in 20 years. This is what Joseph did, but his life was really messed up because people sold him out, people wrongly accused him, things did not go well for him, and in his waiting room, he easily could have said, this is unfair. But he chose to serve in his waiting, and he saved people in the process, including he saved his own family. And that's what eventually led his brothers to bow down to him because of what Joseph did in his waiting room. He served the people around him and got to the point where he was able to take care of this great famine that Egypt was dealing with. He served in his waiting room. In whatever situation he was in, he served those around him. And this is the difference between Abraham and Joseph. The difference was where they put their attention. Abraham kept all the attention on himself. Joseph took all the attention and put it on to other people and served them. This is the difference in what they did when they were tired of waiting. And when we are in our own waiting room, one of the biggest dangers to our faithfulness is us getting tired of waiting. When we go into it thinking, okay, God, this is your will, not mine. I trust you in this. This is your timing and not mine. We go in with the right attitude, with the right faithfulness. But the problem is when time goes on, it starts to wear on us. We start to wait and we wait some more. And we're wondering, God, what are you going to do? And when are you going to do this? Because I went into this trusting you and you're still doing nothing about it. And as we watch other people around us get ahead of life, they start achieving the things that we want to achieve. They start getting the spouses and having the kids or whatever that may be. We start wondering, okay, what's the deal, God? Because everyone else is getting this. Where's my time? When's this going to be good for me? When are you going to answer this prayer? And when we get tired like that, we can start looking for shortcuts. And we start listening to the wrong guidance. We start giving up on God's way and adopting our own way of doing things. And we start turning the focus completely on ourselves and our own desires. And when we're tired of waiting, we start believing lies. We start getting self-doubt. And we start thinking, God, what did I do wrong? Or God, you must not love me or care about me enough to answer my prayer because I've been waiting for so long for you to do something. And then it started causing us to lose faith in God. Like, you know what? Maybe he's there, but maybe he doesn't care. And this is what, when we get tired of waiting, we can fall into that trap. Because the issue is not waiting. We're going to wait in life. The issue is oftentimes we can get weary of waiting. Because we all know we're going to have to wait. God forces us to wait. It's part of our discipleship and growth. And if we're going to follow Jesus, we're going to have to choose to wait on God. This is part of what it looks like to follow Jesus. But it's going to get tiring sometimes. So what do? I think we look at Abraham and Joseph and we learn from them. The first thing I think we need to pay attention to is who are we listening to? Who are we listening to? In our waiting, we need community around us. One of the worst things we can do is wait alone. When we are praying about something, we're having some heavy thing in our lives, we're hoping God does something about it. If we isolate ourselves, that's one of the worst things we can do. We need people around us to help us wait in our waiting room. People to support us, care for us, walk with us. But here's the thing, we need to make sure we're listening to the right voices in our waiting room. I'm sure we can all admit we have people in our lives that they would just say, well, let's do this or just do this. Here's the shortcut in life. Take this route. And if we listen to that advice, it goes against God's way of doing things. And so here's the question. Who do you look for? Who do you go to for guidance when the answer isn't clear and you're waiting? Who are the people you can go to that will keep you focused on following Jesus when the waiting gets tiring? Who are the ones that will carry the burden with you? And those are the things I think we have to look for when we're looking for the right guidance. Who are the ones encouraging us to keep following Jesus, and who are the ones to carry the burden with you? Because as followers of Jesus, we are called to carry the burdens of each other. That if someone comes to you, someone you love, someone's following Jesus, and they're like, hey, I'm struggling with this, you don't go, cool, keep following Jesus and leave them alone. It needs to be, how can I help you with this? How do we carry this burden together? How do you encourage them in that? Who are the people you're looking to for guidance? And so the answer is, who are the ones doing those things for you? You see, this was Abraham and Sarah's failure. They, in that moment of weakness and tiredness, they did not seek out God when they were tired of waiting. They listened to their own faulty advice and they went down the wrong path. Honestly, this is why we value small groups so much. Because here's the deal, Sunday mornings are great. But the problem is when we're meeting in person and watching online, like we're learning, we're exploring, we're worshiping. This is a huge value for us as a church and us following Jesus, but man, we need each other more. And so the idea of being in a small group, it builds relationships, it builds friendships. When things happen, we can carry each other's burdens and point people to Jesus. Now here's the deal. If you get into a small group, not every person in that group is going to be perfectly following Jesus. Like we're all a mess, and you'll learn that. It's a beautiful mess, but it's a mess. But the thing is, when we are together, this is what allows us to have community around us, to be encouraging each other, to support each other, to make sure and encourage each other we're following Jesus together. When we have questions, there's people helping us answer questions. When we have doubts, there's people walking with us through those doubts. When we have burdens, we have other people carrying those burdens with us. This is why this is so valuable. This is why we encourage it so much. So take a step, if you're not in one, to be a part of one. Try it out. Worst thing you can do, that can happen is go, well, I guess I learned more about Jesus and made some friends. I guess that's not much of a waste of a time, right? But this is a chance to figure out who we're listening to. So who are you listening to? The second thing I want to encourage, I think we can learn from these stories, is to serve. The biggest thing that happened between Abraham and Joseph is who they serve. Abraham was looking to serve himself so he can get his offspring, so he can achieve that dream, that prayer he's had, and that promise God have. But he went down the wrong path with the shortcut. Joseph didn't. Joseph served in his waiting. Constantly. For 20 plus years, he served those around him. He served as a slave. He served Potiphar. He served Pharaoh. He served Jesus. He even served his brothers who sold him into slavery. I mean, if there was a shortcut he could have taken, it could have been, oh, there's my brothers who sold me to slavery that caused all this mess. No food for them. Like, simple solution. Austin's not getting food for me. You know what I mean? It's what's going to happen, right? No, he served them, and saved their life. It would have been easy to take the shortcut, but he chose to serve and honor God. And this is how we best work in our own waiting room. By serving, by taking the focus off of ourselves. Often what God is doing in our waiting room is he is transforming us and making us wait so we know better to love him better and to love our neighbors as ourselves better. You see, in our waiting room, we have opportunities to serve like never before if we take the focus off of ourselves. And to do that, we need to look to serve. Because in serving, we humbly look to others' needs rather than our own. And we humbly look to build God's kingdom and not our own kingdoms. And so what does serving look like for you in this season? What are ways you can serve? To take the focus off of yourself. How can you serve your neighbors, your coworkers, your friends, your family? How can you serve within the context of our church? I think one cool celebration was Man Day yesterday. One cool thing about Man Day is I did not plan this thing. A member of our church named Ryan was like, listen, we got to get some guys together and have some fun. I need it. I think other guys could use it. I'm like, yeah, that sounds awesome. I don't have the capacity to handle that right now. What can you do? He's like, I got it. He's a trained rock climber. He can help other people with that. He set up this whole thing. All I did was market it for him. That's all I had to do. It was great. And it was a great day. He served our church. He served us guys who were there yesterday because he said, you know what? This is a long waiting room this season we've been in. Let me serve other people. How can you serve? By jumping in and helping out with kids and helping out with our online ministry, our welcome team, whatever that may be. How can you serve your neighbors by simply, you know what? Why don't you come to church with me? How can you serve them? And here's another thing. How can you serve those who you disagree with? That's a tough one right there. It's easy to serve people you like, right? For the most part. But those you disagree with, it's really hard to humble yourself to serve them. And we're in the season right now where there's a lot of disagreements going on, right? There's the election coming up in a couple weeks. There's a lot of tensions rolling, and it's tough to serve those who maybe think differently than you, act differently than you, believe differently than you. My goodness, God calls us to serve them too. In fact, little preview. Starting next Sunday for 2 weeks, we're diving into a quick series that we're talking about church and politics. And this is for the first time maybe ever at one church, I'm worried about losing people after this series. But you know what? Stay with us, because here's the deal. It's a big deal. And there's a lot to think about and say about it when it comes to us following Jesus, especially with how we treat people who are different than us. How do we serve them? How do we love them? I'm excited for that series as we kick off next week. I'd love for you to join us in person or online, whatever that may be. Invite people to join you. But it's going to talk about the tension of how do we serve those and love those who maybe think differently than us. How do we serve those while we're in our waiting room? Because here's the one thing for today. In our waiting, we need to take the focus off of ourselves and put it on the God and others. So when you're waiting for something, you're in this waiting room, the biggest thing we need to remember when we're getting tired of this is take the focus off of yourself. Take it off of what you're praying for. Take it off of what you're wanting and say, you know what? In this time, I am called to serve other people, to serve God, to serve others. It's about loving them. And in waiting, we have the opportunity to be transformed ourselves in that and transform others as well. Let me tell you about Crystal. Crystal was a part of one church. She's just one of the first people to join one church before we launched. A lot of you guys know her. She's not here anymore, and I'll explain why she's not part of one church. But her story is one of waiting. She was in a waiting room for a long time, and her room was this. She prayed for a long time for a spouse. A lot of her life, her adult life, was one of singleness. And she longed to be married, to find a husband, have a family, all this stuff. And yet she waited in her waiting room for years. Years. And the waiting grew long and it was tiring. And the thing is, she said is oftentimes she had these friends and they were all single together, but then those friends would start getting married and have kids themselves. And that's when life changes. It's harder to hang out with people then because life is different for them. And so she has to change her friend group and all that kind of stuff. Now, she knows like 1,000 people because she's super friendly, but a lot of times her friends would change. And so she'd find new friends to really, invest into. And so as she kept seeing other people's lives change and her still stuck in her waiting room, that's when she said that doubt would creep in. And she would start asking the questions, what did I do wrong? She started thinking of shortcuts like, maybe those past relationships that I know were bad and unhealthy, maybe we can make that work somehow, which is always a bad idea. She started thinking that. She had lots of voices in her life. She had lots of friends saying, hey, I have someone to set you up with, even though it wasn't a good setup, that she tried to listen to them. And she'd see things on social media that would say, you know what, for your life to have value, you have to have a spouse and have a family. And she would see those things and hear those things. And she started believing those lies because she said, maybe my life doesn't have as much value as other people. And that waiting room gets very tiring. But something Crystal did is she stayed focused on God. And so we set up a phone call this week. And just so you know, I did not tell her what I was teaching. I just said, we're doing the waiting room series. Have you ever gotten tired of waiting when you're in that season of life? And what did you do when you were tired? And seriously, one church, I was blown away by the answers. I had a notebook covered in notes by what she was saying. And the first thing she said was this: her life was changed by serving. Very first thing she said. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. Because I had most of my talk written at this point. And the first thing she drops is my one thing, essentially, to get your focus off yourself. And this is what Crystal did. If you knew her, she served like crazy. She worked at Chatham University and she served the students there like crazy. She served in youth ministries. She served at one church. A bunch of you are connected to one church because of Crystal. Not me or anybody else, because of Crystal. And she served like crazy. She served on missions trips. And when people would come across her and they'd see how amazing she is as a person, they would say things like, I can't believe you're not married, which was such a stupid thing to say. But she said it to her. And you know what Crystal did? She took it as an opportunity to share her story. She's like, you know what? Yeah, I pray for a spouse. But in the midst of that, God is setting me up to do some amazing things like serving other people. And she transformed lives because of that. Her waiting room changed her life. It eventually got to the point where she said this. She realized that she could serve so well in the midst of her waiting room that she started seeing God transforming her. And she eventually said that I do not want to get married unless me and my spouse can serve God better as a married couple. Her life was completely dedicated to serving Jesus. And then this past summer, Crystal and Nick got married. And it was a really amazing wedding. It was a COVID wedding where we social distance at the reception. It was awesome. But what I looked at is Crystal was in that waiting room for years, and she met Nick, and she is serving her husband. Her and her husband are serving God together now, better than she was as a single person. One of the things she had to do is move to Ohio. And if there's anything type of serving God, is actually willingly going to Ohio when you lived in Pittsburgh. But this is Crystal's heart. It's for Jesus, and her and Nick are loving Jesus together. But in her waiting room, she reminded me and is reminding us that God is setting us up in our waiting room to serve others like no other time in our lives. That we can be transformed and transform others when we take the focus off of ourselves and put it on to others. She served and she listened to the right voices. And the focus was not on herself, but on God and others. And her story is a testament to what we do in our waiting when we're tired. So I thank God for Crystal and the story she shares. And this is what we do in our waiting room. And whatever you're waiting on, the temptation can be to focus on yourself. But God calls us to something more, something better, to live a life of service to him and to others. Because following Jesus will require waiting. And in your waiting room, don't refuse that waiting. Choose to wait by serving other people. Let our waiting rooms be a transformation time for us like it is for Jesus, to be more like Jesus, who is the ultimate servant. Jesus was patient in his waiting. Jesus was loving in his waiting. But ultimately what he did is he served. He served like crazy. He ultimately served by laying down his life for me and you. And so as we wrap up this series, what I remember is thank God that Jesus didn't get tired of waiting. He didn't get tired of waiting on you and me to get our act together to finally get right with God. He didn't wait for you and me to say, all right, maybe now it's time for me to figure out God. No. Jesus said, I'm going to go to you and let you know how much you're loved by the God of the universe. He didn't get sick of our act. He didn't get sick of our sin. He says, you know what? I love you so much. In the midst of all that, I'm going to come and lay down my life for you. Before you choose me, I'm choosing you, Jesus says. Thank God for that. And so as we wrap up this series, we're going to wrap up with some worship and communion to remember that God chose us. That in our waiting rooms, we can get tired of waiting on him, but he is constantly working. And he's working on us to become more like his son, so let's remember that. So what's going to happen is I'm going to pray. Aaron and Scott are going to lead us in a song to worship God in, and then I'm going to come back. We're going to end our service and end this series together with communion. So let's pray. God, thank you so much for today and this church and, God, this series. God, I pray that this series, that maybe some of us are in a waiting room now, God, and this series was super relevant to us, but maybe we're not in a waiting room. A year from now we will be, or 2 years from now we will be, and we're stuck in that waiting room. God, I remember to choose to trust you in our waiting. That when we get tired, God, we take the focus off of ourselves and put it onto you and others to build your kingdom, to love you and love our neighbors as ourselves. God, transform us in our waiting room and remind us that in our waiting, we're not wasting time, that you are moving and working and constantly loving us by the work that you're doing around us. That's you, we pray.